Everyone in powerlifting loves to talk about how important hip internal rotation is. But then none of them can tell you why it's important. And when they tell you what to do about it, the best thing they can come up with is a 90-90, which is totally fine for creating range of motion access at the hips, but isn't all that great when we're trying to get that range of motion to carry back over to squatting and deadlifting. So today, we are going to talk about training for hip internal rotation, both to build the strength to pull into it, as well as build the coordination to be able to use it underneath a heavy barbell. But first, we're getting to why hip internal rotation is important in the first place. I'm going to slide up the wall here and put the microphone on my hat. Now, imagine for me, if you will, that my index fingers are the shafts of your femur and my thumbs are the head and neck of your same two femurs. We'll also need to imagine that there is a pelvis in between the femurs so that you have an anatomically correct imaginary hip. Now, if we are hitting squat depth, obviously we need to access hip flexion in order for the hip to get below the knees. But what happens alongside with that flexion is very important, because if we are forced or jammed into external rotation, the femur is going to drop below the pelvis, making it difficult for the squat to ever get to depth. Now, on the other side, if we allow internal roll as we hit squat depth, as we access more hip flexion, the pelvis is going to drop below and between those femurs, making it much easier for you to find depth. And if you're wondering what a squat's going to look like if you lack IR on one side, that leg is usually going to be kicked way out, and that pelvis is usually going to be jacked up higher because we aren't allowing the roll to let the pelvis drop below the femur. And if your squat looks like that, it usually feels pretty shitty, either in the adductors or lateral hip because it's getting yanked on as we're being forced away from that IR, or in the hip capsule itself because shit is binding up as you're struggling to hit depth. Now, improving hip IR access can improve those symptoms on its own because it will be taking pressure off of those structures, but we also want to build up tolerance at those structures themselves, which we're going to do when we look to train hip IR ability. And the first question we need to ask is, what muscles contraction will help facilitate IR, because those muscles are the ones that we want to get strong. On the outside of the hip, we're going to be looking at the anterior fibers of the gluteus medius, the gluteus minimus, and the TFL, because when these guys contract, they're going to be creating internal rotation as well as abduction, and that is going to look like the knees out femur roll that we want happening during our squats. And the easiest way to introduce training those guys specific to a squat is to choke a band around something low, loop the other end of the band. And the easiest way to introduce training those guys specific to your squat is to choke a band around something low, loop the other end of the band around your foot. And I'm not sure if I'm going to still be in frame here, but okay, I'm in frame here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to squat down, and then I'm going to think about contracting the lateral hip on the leg that is not attached to the band to push over and outwards to then push this foot out into the band. I'm focusing on pivoting around this hip and pushing out, and it's going to be that pivot over as I crank the pelvis up on this side that is going to be creating that hip IR as I'm leading with glute med, glute min, and TFL. These guys can be great as a warm-up or primer prior to squats and deadlifts, and once they get easy with a mini band, step up band tension or squat deeper and work to maintain the same degree of control. Now, if we want to load those guys a little bit more aggressively, we're going to want to grab a relatively heavy kettlebell, get into a nice wide stance, grab onto that kettlebell, and use the lateral hip to push you over as you pull yourself back across with the adductors. And the key here is that on the push side, you want to be letting the knee roll in. So we're getting into that IR and then pushing our way through in that position. These guys can also work well as a warm-up or primer, but I definitely prefer them to be pushed hard as an accessory at the end of the training session. And something we kind of touched on there is the adductor's role as a hip rotator. Because the adductors on the front side of your hip, the brevis, the longus, the pectineus, they run from the front of your pelvis to the front of your femur. So when they get shorter, not only do they adduct the leg, but they're also going to help with rolling that femur inwards. So if we want to start building them up, a Copenhagen plank can be a really good place to start, but we can make it even better. When we're in that Copenhagen hold, we can either work to rotate the foot around as we're holding the plank, or we can start to rotate the body around the hip to begin to challenge the adductors in their rotational role. Once we build up strength in rotation alone, we can start to rotate externally as we lower our hips towards the ground, and then we can pull our toes down and rotate internally as we raise ourselves up to get those anterior adductors working really hard in both their adduction and rotation roles at the same time. And part of the problem with everything that I've shown you guys so far is that none of it really looks like a squat. So here is where we're going to start to get a little bit adventurous, because something I really like for building into hip internal rotation is going to be a single leg kneeling squat done on a bench, so we can have the other hand to help us hold on for balance. The goal here is basically to plant yourself down, let your butt roll inside of the heel, so we're accessing that femoral IR, and then we're just going to come back up. So it's loading into the glutes, accessing that IR, pushing ourselves back up to the top. And if this doesn't feel hard enough and nasty enough on its own for you, gotta put the mic on my hat again. You can hold on to a kettlebell to make it a little bit grosser in terms of loading. Now, that is going to be a little bit limited in loading and is best suited as a warm-up or a primer. So we should probably do something a little bit more practical and a little bit less stupid next, which is where I'm going to run a step up with some internal rotation intent. And I like using heel elevation for this because I feel like it completes the picture really nicely. Now, the goal for this step up to work is to pull your knee in and get over your legs so that you're accessing that hip IR. From that point, all you're going to do is try to load into your adductors and glutes, push up to the top, and then let that knee track in as you roll over that hip on the way down. This should feel really gnarly on the hip if you're doing it right. And what makes it a strict step up is that we're not jumping off the bottom to get ourselves up. We're keeping the down leg long, the toes pulled up, making sure that we are loading into the working hip and not getting help out of the bottom. And for these guys, load them up, push them hard, get them very, very strong. And I also should note that we can run a similar knee in, pelvis around type intent, or even rotate into the bottom of a split squat to access IR with the split. But I find if someone's just starting out, the step up is a easier option to nail the intent. And last but not least, I'll show you guys what I would do if I'm already warmed up, already squatting, and stuff feels a little bit funky. I am going to find myself a little bit of a deficit to stand on, because even though the stall mat is only 3/4 of an inch difference, that 3/4 of an inch is going to tip my pelvis over to my right side, forcing more internal rotation on that right leg as I squat down. And if I can run a few reps working with that extra IR access on that right hip here, it almost always feels a little bit better once I get under the squat bar. So if you guys are missing hip internal rotation, yes, 90-90s can be a very good way to get that range of motion back, but we also want to train that range of motion in a way that will carry back over to our squats and deadlifts. So train that lateral hip and train those adductors hard. Then make sure you're using things like step ups and split squats with a IR intent in order to build the coordination necessary to carry that back into a squat. If you guys have hip issues, give this stuff a run. And if you need help with something else, hit that link below and sign up for Team Activated, because we will get your problem solved.